to the book group, and here we are once again come together for our Richard Rolle, The Fire of Love, and this time we've come to chapters 18 to 25. Now, originally, I called this section The Penitential Life. And I have to say that when I go through the book and give these titles, I am reading very rapidly. And usually there's one or two words that jump out at me and I say, oh, I'll call it that. And as luck would have it, or by divine kindness, it seems to have always worked in the past. But I kind of have a feeling that it's not so much worked this time, because it feels to me that this section isn't so much about the penitential life as about Richard Rolle's thoughts and feelings and a whole hodgepodge on two central ideas, which is perfect love and perfect life. And how these two, which sort of dominate this section, but also how these two interrelate. And once we start thinking about them, perfect life and perfect love, and you look at them as you go through these chapters, you suddenly sort of see how he actually is kind of... Can I just check? Can you all hear me okay? Yes? Yes. Great. My camera's gone. It's one of those evenings, but you can see hear me. Fabulous. That's really good. It's going to be one of those nights, I hope. Well, I hope it's not going to be one of those nights when the technology goes a little bit weird. Anyway, great. You can see me once again. I'll have to keep an eye out on the little picture of me up in the corner and see if it flashes out. Okay, so I was saying something about this perfect life and this perfect love, and how these chapters show how they are kind of interrelating to each other, so that in the end, it feels like a bit of a dance, these moving perfect love, perfect life, until they actually keep repeating themselves in this sort of beautiful way, that to have a perfect life is about having perfect love, and perfect love is what is the perfect life. So let's try and unpick it a little bit as we go through the text, because I found this quite a fascinating bit of writing. And I got the feeling, I mean, I might be completely wrong, but I got the feeling that Richard Rolle was either being really clever with his structuring, and he had ultimately kind of structured it all together and he knew exactly what he was doing, or that this is just somebody who is on a stream of thoughts. Oh, and I want to tell you about this. Oh, yes. And then there's this. And oh, yes, I must tell you about that too. And it's kind of, that's why it feels sort of like we're going this way and then we're getting that way. So, but I'm sure you can have your own opinion and have a chat about that, whether it's structured or it's free flow, or whether there's a little bit of both. And we can see this in the circular nature, as I say, of the chapters. So he begins by talking about perfect love, which then leads him into talking about the perfect life. And then he returns once again to talking about perfect love, that leads him into talking about perfect life. So let's have a bit closer, as I say, and have a look at these chapters and just try and untangle a little bit of what might be going on, or what you also think might be going on in them, and what Rolle may be trying to say to us. I think it's really worth noting, before we dive into some textual analysis, is that there are two passages of scripture that are really undergirding what Richard Rolle is saying. in these chapters. They're kind of the base notes. He has lots of quick, short biblical references, but these seem to be the two passages that he is really sort of working out of and thinking about. The first is Matthew, comes from Matthew, chapter 7:14. It comes right at the beginning of chapter 18. Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." So a real demarcation there. Jesus is giving us the easy, the narrow gate, which is the hard way, and the wide gate, the wide road that leads to destruction. It's very clear what we may think about that. How we understand that, of course, is very interesting. So Rolle describes this. How he understands it is he sees this as the way of the penitential life, that it's a difficult road for anyone who intends to love God perfectly. The road, and he writes, through which the flesh sheds its unlawful things and worldly comforts, through which the soul is held back from degenerate delights and carnal pleasures. Through it, the soul is totally given over to love the divine. So he's saying it's the road of renunciation, it's the road of perfection, and it's also the road of perfect love. So he's already combining in that one biblical passage the notion that how you live your life is reflected in how much you love God. The other is also from Matthew, and this comes from chapter 19, verses 21. Well, the main bit is around 21, but do you remember there's that whole section about the young man who comes to Jesus and says to him, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" Then he said to him, why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments. He said to him, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. Also, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said to him, I have kept all these. What do I still lack? And Jesus said to him, if you wish to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. So there in that biblical passage, Jesus is using the language of perfection, and he's using the language of renunciation. So in a way, we can see that the whole of this structure that Rolle has been setting up is actually a bit of an exegesis of perfection and renunciation. Now we have to remember that Richard Rolle, of course, the one big area that he wrote on mainly was actually on biblical commentaries. So he was very well known for this. So it's not surprising that we see in his text a lot of kind of biblical interpretation. And it seems to be that these are the two passages which undergird his understanding of perfection, the perfect life, perfect love, with the idea of renunciation, go sell everything. And then, of course, the great, and come follow me. That's the great call, the call of perfect love, of course. As I said, there are many references to Scripture in these passages, but these two seem to act as those base notes which hold together the view of perfect love and perfect life, and how they're interconnected. And that the heart is renunciation. And I want to give you just a very quick, brief summary of the chapters, okay, just to rush through. So perfect love is the basis of all the virtues that leads one to the penitential path of renunciation, which is lived out in the life of prayer. The life of prayer is the solitary life of renunciation of the world and leads to perfect love, which leads to perfect life, where whatever our hearts loves is in God, that flows into the life of love that conforms itself into the Creator. So it's a kind of cyclical dance and interplay of perfection, of life and love. All this flows, it seems to me, from Jesus's words. If you wish to be perfect, go and sell everything and come follow me. So let's have a little closer at these two aspects, perfect love, first of all, and then perfect life. So he begins by looking at perfect love in chapter 18, where he opens with this lovely image, a wonderful image of charity. Now, in my mind, I'm understanding this charity is the queen of all the virtues, as charity is the love of God within the soul, and how we act, the love that we have for others, the love we have for our neighbours, the love of charity is actually the sort of manifestation of God's love within the soul. So in a sense, I have read this kind of charity is the queen of virtues as sort of what's the word? It's a kind of recognition and a description of God's love within the soul. So it's the queen of all virtues. But what I love is that image of it's the loveliest star on earth, that beauty of soul which produces all these effects in our soul. So somehow the love of God is the beauteous, the wonderful star, the loveliest star that actually enables us to do all the other virtues. A man can possess no virtue that has not been planted in this love of God. So love of God is the way that it becomes manifest in us, that sort of perfect love. So right at the beginning, charity is planted in the soul by God, and he uses the language of love longing, so that soul, that love in the soul he is, wounds her, makes her long for God, and all the virtues, as I say, are rooted in this love. So straight away, this love is what makes someone strive then to renounce everything that's contrary to divine love. This is the narrow way. This is the way of renunciation. And then when we move to chapter 19, Rolle seems to develop this. He begins to show us how easily and how quickly this perfect love can be sullied or confused or replaced by carnal love, by human love. And of course, he's going to return to that once again when we come to chapters 23, 24, 25, the last section when he talks all about, if we replace God's love with love of his creatures, then we've kind of turned it into, we've adulterated it even. He uses very strong language. Rolle is wise enough to know that sin and its attraction, it can never wholly be extinguished. And he writes, when a man is perfectly converted to Christ, he will hold in contempt all things that are transient, but keep a tight hold on his longing for his Maker, as far as it is given to mortals. So he understands that this road of loving God is going to be a narrow one. It's going to be a narrow one. Then in chapter 20, Rolle moves to consider what helps a person then to keep that tight hold on the love of God, his longing for his Maker. And of course, Rolle is a very good spiritual director and spiritual, guide in the prayer life. Says, well, it's only one thing that can really hold the mind in this stabilitas, is the great life of prayer. But he doesn't say it's just the life of prayer. He says that it is continual prayer. This is going to be your great help. And what's really interesting is then he first of all sets out for us what the prayer life is going to look like spiritually. So we moved from love to how you're going to hold on to it. Well, you need to do this thing, which is prayer. So what does prayer look like? And he goes into the importance of prayer and what it does for us. So first of all, and he sections it out very clearly, each one has a nice little biblical section to it. So first of all, it helps us follow Christ as he spent many nights and praying in the mountains. So that is a really good exemplar for us to follow the life of Christ, just as he did. The second is that prayer is going to help us to acquire grace. It's going to enable our hearts to grow with that love that God can give, that perfect love. Thirdly, it's that life of prayer. It's prayer that's going to kindle our souls with the fire of divine love. So it's going to keep it awake, keep it longing, keep it alive within the person. Fourthly, it's the thing that's going to enable us to be saved. And fifthly, to busy ourselves in good works. Now at this point, he has moved to start thinking about good works. That difference between the solitary life, which is completely focused on prayer, and on the active life, which is then focused also on works of charity, but also on good works, as he says, on good works. Busy ourselves in good works. So there we have an echo of what makes and forms the active life. So he's moving us to start to think about, so there's a life of prayer, which helps us in a life of action. It's not surprising that this description of the inner life of prayer then leads to a discussion of the outer life, the life of the contemplative then, and the life of the active. Now, of course, during this period, in the late 14th century, it was very clear demarcation between the two. You either were a contemplative, you followed the contemplative life, you were enclosed either as a hermit or as an anchoress, or you lived in community. You can either live in the community as a religious, or you could live in community in, ordinary social life. So there were these two very clear demarcation in people's lives. And we see it in The Cloud of Unknowing. He has this whole section where he talks about Mary and Martha, the story of Mary and Martha, where Mary is seen as the contemplative and Martha is seen as the active. Basically, well, Mary's chosen the best life. And that's exactly what we see going on within Richard Rolle. He too, in a whole chapter, it's all of chapter 21, which is quite a long chapter. All of 21 is handed over to a kind of discussion, a debate about these two forms of life. The life of prayer, which flows out of prayer, and the life of action, which then is about doing good things in the work, which is the movement and action of love within the world, rather than the silence of prayer and the dedication to perfect love. Now, at this time, as I say, they were very marked. And in Norwich, a place like Norwich alone, there were 29 anchorites or anchoresses who were attached to little parish churches. So across the country, there, I think, at one point, Rosa Mary Clay, I think I was saying last week, there are about 450 or something like that, anchorites or hermits across the whole country. So it was a very big aspect of life. It really was not seen as it would be today, a kind of, well, it's only for one or two people who, may be especially called. But it was very much part of the medieval world. And so what we find happening in this chapter, which is quite interesting, is there is this apologetic tone to Rolle's writing. He seems to be saying that, or giving us an impression that actually at this time, contemplatives or the solitary life was actually under some kind of criticism, that he's defending the solitary life of prayer over those who actually say, well, no, that's a waste of time. You should be doing good works in the community. That's what you should be doing. And this other life, And he's saying, don't listen to the people who will criticize you, because you know what you're doing. You know that you're following this distinctive, perfect life, and stick to your guns. But it's really interesting that even back then, that there was this kind of unease, this is dis-ease, perhaps, about this demarcation of two lives. One was perfect and the other was not. And Rolle gives us a little bit of an interesting statement on page 112, right at the end of this chapter, where he actually says, well, if you could maintain a ministry in this body, at the same time experience within himself the song of heaven, absorbed in the melody and the joy of everlasting life, well, if you could achieve both the contemplative and the active life, well, then that would be the ultimate life of perfection. Of course, what he's describing there is the life of Christ, because as we all know, Christ has this whole kind of contemplative, spiritual, solitary life of devotion to God the Father, and at the same time was active in his ministry of healing and teaching and preaching and being amongst the most vulnerable. But of course, Richard Rolle knows this, and so he says, I don't think anyone can really be exactly like Christ. And yet, this may also be a little bit of a pop at poor old Walter Hilton, because Walter Hilton at this time is also writing about what he calls the mixed life, that there is a way, there is a possibility that we can combine not only the office of the active life of doing good works, of charitable living, of living out that charity that God puts in our souls, as well as having that contemplative singularity of love for God, which is love that is only for God and not for any other human distraction or thought or marred by sin. So it's a very interesting kind of thing that's going on here. And then suddenly 22 begins to refer back, takes us back in our thinking, back to chapter 18, and that whole notion of the penitential path, the path of the life of virtue, which, as we remember, is a narrow one. He moves quickly from the perfect life to perfect love once again, and starts to tell us reminds us that the fire of love is seen to clean out all vice. It feels to me like he's coming, but he's already kind of discussed this, and he's coming back to it once again, having understood a little bit more of what it's like and how the effects of the fire of love can have on us. It can actually clear away all the problems, all the vice, and it can even burn up venial sins. What a remarkable thing to say, because he's also been saying, well, no, you can never not really in this life, be without sin. And yet here he's telling us, well, this love, this perfect love, it's the thing that's going to actually sort out sin for you. So it's really complex what he's talking about here, and really complex in how he's relating the love of God, the divine love, with how it works out in the human life. And then, of course, he suddenly returns back, after talking about that, he returns to the life of perfect man. How is this burning up of sins revealed and enabled by the solitary life? And here he goes into 5 actions or consequences. So the life of the perfect man will have a rejecting of all the care of worldly affairs. That's the first thing. Secondly, of leaving behind one's parents and one's property. Thirdly, spurning all transient things. Fourthly, destroying all things of the flesh. And finally, refraining from wanton desire. So all of that you can hear is about renunciation, the narrow way. And all of this is through that burning love of the Creator alone. And it leads him then once more to take us back to that initial description that he has that was based on his own experience of the fire of love, that fire which is about the language of warming the heart, love and longing. And he uses that wonderful image of the seraphim, the burning seraphim and it's all about music, glowing and being near and being inflamed. And what I find really interesting now is what he then goes on to talk about, because he's taken us to this kind of, oh my goodness, it's all about this love. And I can see how the perfect love of God that inspires me, well, actually, that's the thing that will enable me to walk the narrow way. That's the thing that will drive my life to renunciation of sin and all the distractions. That's the thing. All I have to do is live that in my life. And he's even showing me how to do that. And then he goes back, and it's like he comes back down to earth with a bit of a bump. And he really starts to tell us, I think, about some of the things that he struggles with. And it's really clear that what he struggles with most of all is this idea of love that becomes adulterated, the perfect love that is adulterated by the love of the excessive love for another human being. And he talks all about the kind of yearning of men for their desires for a woman. And he goes into it, and he unpacks it all, and he tells us all about it. And, it makes me wonder, is this how some people feel when they fall in love? Is this the passionate desire of lust, which is an adulteration of human love and an adulteration of God's love? And it's really interesting how he goes into this. And it seems to me that what he's doing is that he's been talking all about the language of desire. He's been talking all about the language of love longing and of warmth and of all that. And now he's going back to then remind us that actually all that language can actually be used in lust for another person. So it's like he's sort of saying, I know I'm using this language about the love of God, but don't mistake it for this love of human being, which is the passionate carnal desires that he sees as actually a misrepresentation, a misunderstanding. You can replace the love of God with the love of a human being very, very easily. And he goes into this quite a lot. And I find it really interesting that Richard Rolle is often criticized for disliking women. But that doesn't seem to be what he is going on here. Is actually he's talking perhaps about his own experiences of the passion, the hot fervor of love. And also he then says, well, women are not immune from this, because of course, don't you also love to be the center of someone else's love? So he brings it right into the sphere and sort of shows, and this, in a sense, is what you need to have renunciation for. You renounce that for the perfect love of God. If you want to know what the perfect love of God, well, it's not like human love. It's not that form of human love. Of course, there is the perfection of human love. Of course there is. When we love another, we love God within another, but that's not setting the other in the place of God and confusing what love is all about. So as I say, I found these, I don't know, it would be interesting what you get to talk about, but how you understand them. I found them really quite complex and really quite difficult to kind of get my head around. So I've given you a few questions which I hope will enable you to have a conversation or just to have a discussion about what do you think's going on? What's he trying to say? And does it have any relevance or resonate with our spiritual lives today?